My grandson's husband raised his glass and introduced me as the witch who wrecked us in front of everyone. I felt the burn in my chest, but I steadied my smile. 65 years had taught me how to stand tall through humiliation. Quietly, I reached for the folder in my purse, knowing proof would one day speak louder than their insults. What they didn't realize was that this dinner was only the opening move in a reckoning they couldn't control. Before I continue the story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early, a habit I hadn't shaken since my teaching days. My gift for Celine was simple, wrapped in yesterday's newspaper the way my mother once did. The paper crackled softly under my arm as I stepped inside. The place smelled faintly of buttered rolls and polished wood. Before I could make my way to the dining room, a young man in a catering vest pressed a tray into my hands. "Take this to table 3, he said, without looking at me. For a second, I froze. He thought I worked here. I looked down at my plain jacket, the sensible shoes. The tray wobbled in my grasp. I forced a polite smile, set it gently on the service counter, and told him quietly, "I'm a guest." He didn't even hear me. I stood there invisible in plain sight, the sting sharp but familiar. I smoothed the wrapping of the gift and walked toward the main hall, swallowing the ache the way I always had. The room was still being prepared, soft lights flickering against polished glasses. I scanned the long table for my name card. At first, I glimpsed it near Selena's spot, close to where a grandmother should be. But when I looked again, the card was pushed far down near the swinging door, where waiters would pass through with trays. My seat had been moved. I touched the card with one finger, feeling the cheap paper bend. Once upon a time, I was the hostess of these gatherings, the one at the head of the table. Now I was tucked against the wall, a shadow in my own family's celebration. My mind whispered a cruel question. When did I become the extra chair nobody wanted? The sound of laughter carried into the room as the first guests arrived. Friends of Celine, bright and young, swept in with colorful dresses and fresh perfume. Vera stood at the entrance, greeting them warmly as though she were the star of the evening. My daughter-in-law knew how to shine under chandeliers. She kissed cheeks, exchanged compliments, and pulled people into her orbit. I slipped into my reassigned seat without fuss. A few guests nodded at me in passing, polite but distracted. I nodded back, folding my hands in my lap. Nobody lingered long enough to ask how I was. I kept my eyes on the polished silverware, the flickering candles, the place cards arranged with calculated care. Houston evenings had once been filled with my cooking, my tablecloths, my laughter. Those days felt far away now. The doors opened wider, and Selena entered with Callum at her side. She was glowing cheeks flushed with youth and excitement. For an instant, her eyes met mine, and warmth flickered there. A flash of the little girl who once ran to me with scraped knees and spelling tests. I nearly lifted my hand to wave, but Callum leaned in close, guiding her toward Vera. He whispered something that made her laugh nervously. She didn't look back. I stayed still, watching as my granddaughter was pulled gently but firmly into someone else's circle. Vera touched her arm. Callum guided her elbow, and together they created a shield. I pressed my palms together, feeling the pulse in my wrists. The noise swelled, voices, clinking glasses, bursts of joy. I raised my water glass and held it tightly as if it were an anchor. Around me, the celebration gathered strength, but my seat remained the coldest one in the room. The evening was just beginning, but already it felt like a trial. Callum rose from his seat, straightening the cuffs of his jacket as if the whole room belonged to him. He tapped his glass, the sound sharp enough to quiet the chatter. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice smooth, rehearsed. He spoke of Selene's accomplishments at school, of Vera's tireless effort to arrange everything, of Harlan's steady support. Each name he called out was met with a burst of clapping and approving glances. I sat, still waiting for mine, waiting for the acknowledgement that I had once taken for granted. It never came. He closed his remarks with a wide grin, raising his glass high as if his circle was complete without me. I pressed my lips into a faint smile, careful not to let my hands tremble around the stem of my glass. Inside my chest, a knot tightened, but I swallowed it down with the water I sipped. The clinking of silverware filled the space, and conversations sprang up around me like fireworks. Cousins leaned across plates to share jokes. Friends traded stories, each one louder than the last. Glasses touched with ringing cheer. I listened, but their laughter felt like it came from another world. Not so long ago, some of these people used to rush to my side at gatherings, throwing their arms around me. Tonight they nodded politely at best, slipping back into their seats without lingering. Silence was easier for them than the discomfort of crossing Vera. I studied their faces, the ones who chose not to see me. The choice was clear, and it was heavy. At the front of the room, a long table displayed gifts, wrapped in glossy paper with ribbons curled like streamers. Celine began opening them one by one, her fingers brushing gold tissue velvet boxes, sleek bags that caught the light. Applause followed each reveal, a rhythm of approval. Then her hand landed on mine, the square wrapped in the day's paper. The print showed faint ink smudges from the classifieds. A cousin smirked his voice, carrying across the room. "Looks like trash from the garage." The laughter was not cruel at first, more awkward, but it spread rippling through the rows like a small storm. Celine's smile faltered her hand, hesitating on the knot I had tied. Before she could continue, Vera slid another shiny box forward, her gesture practiced seamless. The laughter smoothed into another round of cheer, and the paper with my wrapping slid quietly to the side, almost hidden. I steadied my fork against the edge of my plate, holding it as though it might anchor me. My lips stayed closed. I didn't defend myself, didn't ask them to remember the days I saved ribbon scraps, or tied gifts in scraps of fabric from dresses long outgrown. One day, I told myself they'll see the truth in my wrapping. The thought wasn't a promise of revenge, it was a reminder that meaning often hides under the plainest paper. My eyes lifted just enough to catch Celine's. For a fleeting second, something unspoken passed between us. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. It was enough. The room carried on. Plates clattered, glasses refilled. Chatter bubbled louder with every toast and joke. My presence shrank, further pressed against the corner of the table like an afterthought. Still, I straightened my back, drew in a steady breath, and whispered to myself so quietly no one could hear. The night isn't over yet. The anticipation sat heavy in the air, a shadow I could feel, creeping closer, promising something heavier still to come. Callum rose again, glass in hand, and for a moment I thought he might offer a proper toast to honor Selene. His voice began warm, thanking her professors, her friends, the people who believed in her. Then, without pause, he turned his eyes toward me. His lips curved into something colder than a smile. "And let's not forget," he said, "our honored guest here, the witch who wrecked us." The words hung above the table like smoke. Fork stilled mid-air. Gasps slipped out before being hushed. I felt my skin prickle heat rising to my cheeks, though the room itself felt frozen. My title had been spoken not as grandmother, but as curse. Harlan shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat as if he might break the silence. "That's enough, Callum," he muttered, but the sound was barely more than a cough. His eyes slid away from mine down into his glass. I searched his face for the defense I once expected from my son. None came. The sting of Callum's insult burned, but the silence of my own child carved deeper. My breath steadied against my will. I would not let them see my chest cave in. Vera leaned back in her chair, her laugh too light, too rehearsed. "Oh, don't take it so seriously," she said, brushing the air with her hand. "It's just a joke." The room loosened under her cue. A few chuckles followed, nervous but obedient, smoothing the jagged edge of what had just been said. I sat motionless, my smile stiff, my fork untouched. Vera had always known how to bury cruelty beneath the guise of humor. Silence, I realized again, was her sharpest blade. From farther down the table, a relative I barely recognized leaned toward another. His whisper wasn't as quiet as he thought. Well, she did cause a lot back then. Heads turned slightly, eyes flicked out, spreading like wine spilled on cloth. In that instant, I understood the years of stories told in corners, the narrative painted without me present, had rooted themselves into memory. My silence had not been empty, it had been filled for me by them. I tightened my grip on the fork until my knuckles ached. My shoulders stayed square, my gaze steady. They might see a witch, but I would give them more than a caricature to whisper about. If they had already written me into that story, then it was time they read the whole of it. The program moved forward as plates were cleared, and coffee cups appeared, a choreography so smooth it almost hid the seams. From my end of the table, I watched the master of ceremonies consult a printed run of show with Callum and Vera. They bent their heads together, pens tapping the margins, two generals with a map. When the paper turned, the light caught a penciled note at the bottom of the gift segment, "Skip the newspaper-wrapped gift." The letters were small, the intent was not. The MC traced the line as if reading it into the record. Callum's jaw loosened, satisfied. Vera pressed the paper, flatter erasing even the shadow of my parcel. I let my fingers rest on the base of my water glass, the way you hold the railing on a moving bus. No scene, not now. To object would make me the headline they've been selling. I took a sip and allowed the knowledge to settle, not to scorch. Gift opening began with a fanfare of tissue and ribbon. Boxes gleamed like showroom windows. Celine's laugh rose and fell with each reveal. Copper earrings, a smartwatch, shoes too delicate for Houston sidewalks. Phones rose like periscopes. The moment belonged to the lens. Someone shouted, "Turn it toward the camera," and she did, obedient and radiant. Then, like a swallow finding the one unpainted Eve, her eyes drifted to the square, wrapped in newsprint at the end of the table. You cannot stop a hand from finding the thing it recognizes. She reached toward it. Under the table edge, Callum slid his fingers around her wrist. Later, he murmured, still smiling for the room. Selene paused, then lowered her hand politely, as if she had only been adjusting a napkin. The chatter swelled again, a tide covering footprints. I swallowed the brine of it and sat taller. "Come on," Callum said when a cousin snickered about the wrapping, flashing his grin as if it were a hall pass. "It's just a joke." The room obeyed, releasing giggles like steam from a kettle. We're only teasing someone added stapling niceness to a cut and calling it craft. Vera slid a glossy package into Selene's hands, voice bright and thin. "Open this one next, darling." The sentence did its job, the same sentence that has cleaned many messes in this family. Call something a joke, and the bruise stops being evidence. It becomes a personality flaw in the person who says it hurts. Callum's grin invited the crowd to forget what it had watched and remember who looked confident. In this room, if you don't laugh, the defect is yours. I kept my eyes on my plate and let the line pass through me like wind through a fence. I felt my face settle into something that read as pleasant from across the room, the expression women wear when the truth would sound impolite. A smile, strategic, rather than sweet. Timing is its own language. I mapped the room in glances who watched with troubled eyes, who studied their plates, who sought Vera's cue before forming an opinion. Mr. Delgado from Harlan's office looked embarrassed. Aunt Noreen examined an earring that didn't need fixing. The neighbor with the perfect manicure stared at a centerpiece as if it might answer for her. The maitre d' hovered by the door. The DJ fussed with a playlist. The MC shuffled cards into small, anxious stacks. By my chair, my purse rested against the table leg, heavier than it looked, paper, not metal. Pages, not weapons. With the toe of my shoe, I found the familiar edge and felt steadied by what waited. Patience, I reminded myself. Harvest a truth too early and it tastes green. Celine's gaze flicked to me, hesitant and quick, an apology pressed into a single blink. I answered by smoothing my napkin and placing it precisely on my lap, a signal almost no one else would read. Let them keep their program. I have kept mine longer. The toasts were lining up glasses, filling the speeches buffed until they shone. The night slid from early glow into the kind of darkness where words travel farther and land harder. The air conditioning sighed and carried a faint slice of citrus from the bar. I counted my breaths, 4 in 4, hold 4, out the old classroom trick that steadied 100 children and still steadied me. I could wait. I had waited years already. If they wouldn't let her open a gift, then I would open their memory. And once open memories rarely fold back the same way. The room seemed pleased with its own warmth, a soft hum around the edges of my quiet. I wasn't leaving, I was listening. When truth finally knocks, it prefers a steady hand on the latch. Vera rose with her flute lifted just above shoulder height, the etched crystal catching the chandelier's light like a small star. If I could have your attention, she called palms, fanning the air for quiet. Chairs scooted, napkins settled. The servers slipped to the walls, their trays held still and level. I felt the edge of the spotlight graze me the way a wave kisses a sandbar there, then gone, while I folded my hands in my lap as if I were back at my old desk waiting for a classroom to hush. My pulse tapped a steady beat against the inside of my wrist. I kept my face smooth, my shoulders easy, my breath measured so no one could say I looked rattled. Around us, the hum condensed into a single attentive silence, a politeness that always feels like a held breath before a storm. Callum eased the mic from the stand with the comfort of a man who loves a stage. "What a night," he said, grin-wide voice warm as butter. He thanked the caterer, praised the planner, honored Celine with an inventory of achievements that made the tables thrum with applause. He swept his arm to include the room basking in it. Then he pivoted, still smiling, and let the blade slip from behind the bouquet. And of course, he added lightly, we have Marla with us, the witch who wrecked us. A laugh snapped loose somewhere, then sputtered. A fork chimed against a plate and stopped. I felt heat rush to my cheeks, while an odd coldness moved across my chest like a cloud. I sat straighter. If my heart stumbled, my posture did not. Celine's smile tried to hold, then faltered. Loyalty tugged one way, embarrassment tugged the other, and her eyes fled to her glass. The room reached for release the way a hand reaches for a switch in the dark. Callum flicked it for them. "Hey, just a joke," he said, palm-up eyes bright with mock innocence. Nervous chuckles answered at once, polite and eager to please. Vera dipped her chin in a tidy nod without ever looking my way, her gaze skimming past me like I was a painting she'd seen too many times to notice. The clatter of breathing returned. The waiters resumed their practiced glide. A man near the head table rescued his discomfort by announcing how excellent the salmon had been. The crowd took the cue, relaxing back into glasses and small talk, leaving my chair ringed by a silence that felt both deliberate and tidy, as if someone had set a velvet rope around me and labeled it, "Do not engage." I lifted my own glass, not high, not low, just enough to be read as courteous, and let a faint, unremarkable smile rest on my face. Silence can beg. Mine did not. While Callum bathed in his applause, I took inventory with the calm of a librarian checking spines after a rowdy event. Who laughed too quickly? Who studied the tablecloth? Who tried to catch my eye and then abandoned the attempt halfway? I charted them the way I used to track which students copied answers and which ones copied posture. Smoke hung where the words had burned, and I did not wave it away. Let the label linger. Let it season the air so that when the truth entered, it would have something to react with. The toasts rolled on benign and glossy a parade of safe sentiments, lacquered with sugar. I sipped water, felt it land like a coin in an empty jar, and kept my gaze steady on Callum long enough for him to notice. He flicked his eyes past me back to the crowd, confident again. Fine. Confidence is loud. Proof is patient. Inside, I set a small marker down. Whatever had been spiteful and sloppy earlier had now crossed into ceremony. There is a difference between a mutter and a microphone. I have lived long enough to know that lines matter. He had drawn one in front of witnesses. I reached for my napkin, refolded the corner that had gone soft, and slid it into place the way you slide a file back into the drawer when you know it will be needed soon. Celine glanced toward me from behind her lifted glass, the barest flinch of apology tugging at her mouth, before it disappeared. I gave her nothing dramatic, just steadiness. The room's air was cool, lemoned by the bar buzzing with those tiny electric sounds people make when they're trying not to stare. A server refilled flutes with the care of someone moving among gravestones. Across the way, Vera laughed at a comment no one else heard and patted Callum's arm, a gesture that belonged in a family album more than a life. I thought of the years I had spent teaching children not to confuse volume with value, and I let that old instruction fill my lungs. Words can bruise. Silence can cauterize. Tonight mine would do neither. It would record. I swallowed my sip and set the glass down so gently the rim made no sound on the linen. They believed the room had swallowed the insult, whole good manners digesting cruelty into memory. They were wrong. I felt the moment lodge exactly where I wanted it, a stone under the table's perfect cloth. They thought the crowd had saved them. It had only seen them. I did not plan to answer with a scene. I planned to answer with the thing scene's fear paper that does not blush and a story that refuses to be told by anyone else. The line was crossed. The night was not over. They thought the room swallowed the insult. I made sure it swallowed their shame instead. Guests drifted toward the long gift table as the toasts dissolved into clinking glasses and relieved chatter. Under the chandeliers, bows glittered like frost stacked on boxes, so glossy they caught everyone's face and threw it back prettier. I moved with the crowd, but a half step behind, the way you walk beside a river you know can sweep you off. At the far end sat my package square modest, wrapped in the Sunday comics I had saved in a drawer. Next to the froth of metallic paper and branded bags, my package looked like a lone sparrow on a runway full of jets. A woman beside me whispered, "Who brings newspaper?" as if she were asking the room permission to be cruel. I kept my eyes on the table and let the words slide past like a draft through a door I had learned not to seal. I chose that paper for a reason. Years ago, Celine sprawled on my living room rug, hair full of sun, circling punchlines with a purple marker. We wrapped her birthday surprises in cartoons so she could read between the tape lines and guess. "I like how it crinkles," she told me, smoothing the paper with the authority of a 7-year-old. Tonight, my fingers remembered the feel of those folds, how newsprint softens at the edges and holds a crease like an old hand remembers a hymn. Around me, the planner directed servers into a choreography of trays and napkins, and Vera tracked each movement as if she were conducting a safer, tidier family than ours. I stayed still. There is a kind of balance you keep by not moving at all. The MC invited Celine forward. "We'll start with this tower," she said, tapping a box as tall as a toddler. Lids lifted, tissue side, cameras hummed. With each unveiling, the room warmed designer leather, a bracelet that blinked a purse, boxed like a museum object. Celine thanked, hugged, posed. When her glance snagged on the comics at the end, her expression shifted, recognition first, then calculation. She reached toward it, and in the same motion her voice softened. "Maybe we'll save that one for later," she said, kind but coached, glancing toward Callum for approval. He chuckled plenty to get through, as if generosity were a schedule, and memory a delay the evening couldn't afford. I felt the old exclusion settle, gentle as dust and just as hard to clean, but a scene is a script until someone walks off it. Celine paused, eyes still on the comics, and then she changed her mind in front of everyone. No, she said clear enough to travel. "I want to open Grandma's first." The hush spread outward like a ripple from a stone, startling those who had been laughing. Hands fell from phones. Someone cleared a throat in the wrong key. I felt my heartbeat in two rails, one of dread, one of a thin, stubborn hope I had no business entertaining. My breath sat high under my collarbone. Callum's smile froze a fraction too long, then resumed as if he could paste it back on. Vera gave the MC a small shake of the head that meant something and nothing at once. Selene lifted the package with both hands, thumbs stroking the taped seams the way you touch a found photograph. The comics gave their familiar crackle. "You always wrapped mine like this when I was little," she said, and the words were a key turning somewhere deep. A few guests managed a soft awe, unsure if it was allowed. The inked panels showed their age, the colors calmer from years in a drawer. The tape yellowed just enough to make the bow sincere. She peeled the corner back carefully as if the paper were part of the gift, which of course it was. I watched her mouth tilt, that serious line she wears when she's about to decide for herself. No one spoke. Even the air conditioner seemed to hold its breath. Celine's face tightened with effort, not emotion, her careful unwrapping suddenly a statement. Callum adjusted his cufflinks, a movement rehearsed to look like restlessness and read like control. Vera lifted her glass halfway and lowered it, undecided about whether the moment required a toast or a dismissal. My mouth stayed shut. I watched the small space between Celine's brows, the place where truth takes off its shoes before it comes inside. In that space, I placed everything I hadn't said tonight, everything they had rewritten for years, and let the silence make room for it. Harlan stood a few feet back, hands in his pockets, like a teenager at his own recital, eyes flicking from Celine's fingers to Vera's face, as if permission lived there. The MC hovered with a professional smile that had nowhere to land. In the reflection of the window, I saw the room arranged like a diagram. The loyal, the fearful, the ones who still might be moved. I let my shoulders settle and felt the weight of my purse at my ankle, steady as an anchor under the tablecloth. Whatever happened next didn't need my voice to be true. It needed patience and paper, and the memory of a child who once read jokes out loud and laughed until she fell sideways into my lap. Some doors open with a key so small it looks like nothing at all. It was just paper to them, but to her it was memory. And to me, it was the first crack in their wall. Servers set cake on linen and the room softened into forks and small laughs. Coffee breathed from silver urns. Someone asked for decaf, as if it could calm the night. I stayed at my place, the comics paper, folded on Celine's lap like a rediscovered photograph. The rush thinned into pockets of talk, small islands of cousins and co-workers. From the table behind me, a voice I'd known since she wore braces lowered itself to a whisper that still found me. She really did tear things apart, didn't she? The sugar on my plate brightened, then dulled to gray. I set the fork down and let the porcelain answer for me with a quiet ring. I have been called worse in darker rooms, but it's the small blades that find the softest places. Beside her glassware chimed and another guest offered the easy verdict of the half-drunk. Everyone knows she made life hard. The words didn't raise their voice. They didn't need to. They arrived already credentialed by repetition. I watched steam wander off my coffee, a thin ghost with nowhere to return. Harlan stared into his phone. Vera tipped her head toward Callum and smiled without showing teeth. Celine's fingers worried the edge of the comic strip. The old ache rose up my ribs. I told it to sit. Not tonight, I said inside. Not this time. The servers reset spoons, aligned cups, and moved on. I stayed still to hear who I had become in their stories. A young woman I didn't recognize, coworker, neighbor I couldn't tell, leaned with the honest curiosity of someone who missed the prequel. "Why do they call you?" that she asked, too loud for a secret, too soft to be cruel. The table hushed, as if the room had held its breath all evening. Even the cake waited. Vera's eyes snapped to mine, then away. Callum rolled his cuff. Harlan's thumbs paused. Celine looked at me, not through me, and I saw the child who used to ask why the moon follows the car. I lifted my cup. I let the saucer speak first porcelain against linen, a small, steady sound that belongs to women who know what silence can do. I held the young woman's gaze and gave her the kindest thing I had, left a measured smile. It wasn't surrender. It was a placeholder. Across the table, Vera laughed at something no one had said and filled the silence with napkin talk, menus, flavors, frosting French, as if passports could save us. The conversation rerouted around me like water around a stone, but the question stayed in the current. I could feel it brushing ankles as it traveled. Why? Music hummed from the corner, protecting no one. The chandelier steadied. I counted who looked away and who didn't. I kept the numbers like beads. It is strange what you notice when you choose not to defend yourself. The young woman glanced back once apologetic, then folded into her friends. She would remember my smile later. I needed her to. Someone behind me hoped the drama wouldn't ruin the slideshow. Another answered that families always have one of those. I let their certainty pass light and cheap as confetti. The truth does not elbow its way to the center. It waits for the room to tire. Callum lifted his glass again, a signal that the evening belonged to him. Dessert is served, he announced, and laughter arrived. Celine shifted. The comic paper whispered. The young woman's question kept circling like a moth, confusing the chandelier for the moon. I remembered my mother's rule for storms: count the seconds between lightning and thunder to know how near the center you are. Lightning had already struck me at the toast. I was still waiting for their thunder to finish. Celine rose to hug an aunt, and in that small rearrangement looked directly at me over someone's shoulder. We held each other's eyes long enough to draw a line across the room, not permission, acknowledgement. I nodded once. She breathed out almost a smile, then returned to her orbit. Callum saw none of it. Vera saw all of it and corrected a fork that didn't need correcting. I don't need the last word, I told myself. I need the right moment. The rumor had already traveled. The question had been asked. Silence had been deployed. That was enough for a single course. When you've been made into a fable, you don't argue at the foot of the bed. You wait until the storyteller tires and then turn on the light. I dabbed my lips with the napkin and laid it neatly beside the plate. The servers began to clear. Chairs scraped. Someone sneezed. The room returned to its theater of normal. Normal had shifted a degree. I felt it in measured glances and careful jokes. The label they tried on me fit them poorly now. It itched and pinched. It would not survive the wash. Grandma Celine said softly when she stepped close under the pretense of adjusting the gift table ribbon. I didn't turn my head. The ribbon didn't need me. I remember she whispered, fingers brushing the newsprint as if to sign her name on it. I let the words rest between us like sugar on fresh fruit. Not a promise, a flavor that returns. She moved away before the room could own the moment. The cousin who'd whispered earlier tried to catch my eye and failed. Her face reddened in the candlelight. The young guest looked from her to me and back again, building a new file where an old rumor had been. I breathed in the scent of coffee cake perfume and a faint curl of candle smoke, the liturgy of American celebrations. Across the room, Harlan rose halfway, then sat, then rose again to help a server. His hands remembered gentleness, even when his spine forgets courage. I saw that and saved it for later. When the plates were gone and the forks lay like small flags surrendered, I folded my hands and let quiet find me. They think whispers can bury a woman like me. They forget the years I spent underground planting bulbs for spring. The room would move to speeches, slideshows, the next planned moment. Mine would not be planned. It would be timed. They thought whispers could bury me, yet they only gave me ground to rise. Some guests reached for coats and clutched tiny evening purses, the room loosening like a belt after dinner. Cake plates were stacked, coffee cooled, and the staff began that quiet choreography of resetting for tomorrow. I felt the bruise of the night press against my ribs, but I did not come empty-handed. In my purse, under a handkerchief stitched with my mother's initials, lay a plain envelope the color of old cream. I touched its edge as if checking a pulse. Not yet, I told myself. Timing has bones of its own, and I would not hurry them. Celine was laughing with a friend, the laugh of someone keeping wind in a sail. Callum worked the room with a salesman's ease, promising rounds of golf he would forget. Vera hovered near the gift table, a lighthouse without mercy. Harlan stacked chairs that did not need stacking, as if penance came with felt pads on their feet. I sipped the last of my coffee and let the bitterness wake me. They had called me a witch. All right, witches keep receipts. The lull arrived like the pause between waves. A server stepped away. The music faded to a low thread. I rose, walked the length of the table as if to collect my shawl, and set the sealed envelope beside the comic-wrapped gift that had finally found a place of honor in front of Celine. I did not announce, point, or clear my throat. I simply laid the paper down and returned to my chair. Stillness is a kind of bell. Heads turned. Callum made his small, confident laugh. More homework, he said, trying to turn the room back toward ease. Vera didn't laugh. Her shoulders lifted and stayed. Selene looked at me. I gave the smallest nod, an old classroom signal that meant, go on if you're ready. Her fingers slid under the flap. The glue gave with a sigh, as if the envelope itself had waited years to breathe. Photos came first. Harlan, in a rented cap and gown, the tassel crooked because he'd insisted on doing it himself, a ribbon cutting at a small office park with a sign that once bore his name, a holiday table where the turkey was dry because I had spent the morning at the bank. Beneath the photos came copies of checks, small figures then larger than the cashier's check with my neat, careful script, letters on school stationery excusing my double shifts, receipts, notes in my hand. Paid March 12th. Final notice cleared. A man at the far end, gray suit, easy posture, leaned in. Harlan, he said, voice carrying without effort. I remember that year. Your mother kept payroll alive when clients stalled. We all knew. He looked at me and gave the kind of nod men reserve for coaches and medics. Callum's smile lost a tooth. Vera's mouth arranged itself into concern the way people do when the optics require compassion. Harlan stared at the tablecloth as if it contained a map he should have learned long ago. Celine held a photograph up toward the chandelier light, washing across the glossy paper. In it, she was three perched on my lap, my arm around her, as we blew out candles on a sheet cake. The corners were soft from being carried through moves and winters. Grandma, she murmured more to herself than to me. I watched recognition travel across her face. This was not a stranger's story, and it had not been told by accident. Whispers of a new kind rose and fell, less verdict, more recalculation. I heard the arithmetic of a room learning it had been using the wrong numbers. Someone near Vera asked too brightly if the slideshow was next. Soon Vera answered, but the word missed its chair and fell to the floor. Callum reached for Selene's elbow. She didn't move. The envelope lay open like a little door. I kept my seat and let the papers breathe. I did not explain that I had sold a ring to float a contractor's invoice. I did not mention the months when I ate soup at my desk because pride tastes like pepper and salt. The documents could carry that weight without my help. The steam from fresh coffee found me again. I wrapped my hands around the cup and decided I could be warm without being softened. Guests who had been on their way out set their coats back down. A cousin who had said the word witch earlier looked as if the syllables had soured in her mouth. The young woman who'd asked me why stepped nearer to see the checks. "That's your handwriting," she asked. "It is," I said, and nothing more. Not triumph. Not plea. Simply a fact returned to the ledger. Harlan cleared his throat. "Mom." He started, then stopped. A life can pivot on one sentence you decide not to finish. He tried again, the engineer inside him, looking for a structure that wouldn't collapse. "I should have," he said, and I saved him by sipping my coffee. The apology would come or it wouldn't. I was no longer auditioning for it. Across the room, the slideshow screen shone blue and patient. No one noticed. Attention had tilted, and gravity does what gravity does. Callum, who had managed the evening like a presentation, found his slides out of order. Vera smoothed a runner that was already flat. Celine gathered the photos into both hands as if they might bruise if dropped. She stood with the envelope against her chest, a woman holding a book she intends to finish. I set the empty cup down and felt the table steady under my palms. For once the room didn't laugh. It listened. And listening is the first crack in any wall built of stories. I breathed once long and slow and let the room settle around me like steady weather. I rose without raising my voice. Chairs scraped as a few guests glanced my way, curious or wary. My palms stayed flat against the linen tablecloth. "Would you mind calling the manager Bryn?" I asked a nearby server. My tone was even practiced. It was the kind of request I used to give students in the classroom, measured not dramatic. A ripple of murmurs spread like the hush before rain. Callum smirked across the table, clearly convinced I was about to embarrass myself. Vera's hand landed on his arm in quiet solidarity, a squeeze that said, "We're in control." Harlan ducked his head and stared at the candlelight dancing in the glass. Celine, though, did not look away. Her eyes followed me with something between fear and curiosity. From my purse, I drew a single folded sheet and set it by the centerpiece angled, so the edge just caught the chandelier's glow. I didn't touch it again. I let it sit where anyone could see if they dared, and I smiled, not wide, not trembling, but the kind of smile that knows patience is stronger than volume. Bryn arrived a few minutes later, calm and professional, with her black binder tucked under one arm and a tablet balanced in her hand. She was accustomed to smoothing over disputes about menus and bills, not family storms. "What can I help with?" she asked. "I'd appreciate it if you could confirm the host of record for this evening," I said, my voice steady. Brows lifted around the room. Callum leaned back, arms crossed, sure he was about to watch me unravel. Bryn tapped her tablet, then flipped to a printed page for cross-checking. I slid my folded copy forward, unfolding it with a neat crease. Names aligned, payment method matched, date and timestamp sat in perfect agreement. The silence thickened, forks stilled in midair. Bryn looked up clear and unflinching. The contract lists the host of record as Marla. For a heartbeat, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. A fork slipped from someone's hand and clinked against porcelain, the only sound in the sudden stillness. I didn't gloat, didn't nod in triumph. I simply inhaled, letting air fill the space Callum had been holding all evening. "She has no power here." Callum barked too loud, his voice cracking the hush. The sound was half rage, half desperation. Bryn did not blink. Per contract, she read evenly the host controls, all run-of-show adjustments, introductions, and microphone use. The words landed like a gavel. Heads turned from him to me and back again. The same guests who had laughed uneasily at his jokes now pulled back into their chairs, unwilling to miss what would follow. Selene's eyes widened, her hand frozen over the stack of photos from earlier. Vera's jaw tightened, lips pressing thin as pressed paper. Harlan closed his eyes, his silence a heavier weight than any accusation. The air had changed. They all felt it. I inclined my head toward Bryn. "Thank you," I said softly, as if she'd simply brought another round of coffee. "Would you please ask staff to correct the acknowledgments and allow me a brief word?" "Of course," Bryn said, her professionalism as firm as granite. She gave a subtle nod to her staff. Callum tried to recover with a grin, but it was a mask with no eyes behind it. Vera stared at the contract lying flat on the table as though it had betrayed her personally. Guests whispered, the tone different now, no longer laughter at me, but recognition of a shift none of them had predicted. Harlan whispered almost too quietly for me to hear Mom. He didn't finish. He couldn't. I spared him by saying nothing. I let the legality settle. It had its own weight, more enduring than any toast or whisper. Dust falling reveals what has been standing all along. The microphone was placed gently at my setting, the cord coiled like a resting serpent. I didn't touch it. Not yet. I looked at Celine. The envelope from earlier still sat near her plate, photos and documents tucked carefully inside. She held them as if afraid to let go. The room leaned toward me, not because I demanded it, but because they understood at last that I didn't have to. They had spent all evening laughing, dismissing, whispering. Now the air bent differently. Authority rested with the one they had tried to erase. I kept my hands folded, my smile steady, and let them wait. If paper can correct a room, I thought, then truth can correct a family. A phone buzzed against glass somewhere to my right, a nervous little bee that wouldn't quit. The screen lit the linens beside Callum's plate, a cold square glow that turned his jaw the color of dishwater. I didn't need my glasses to read the banner. It marched across the lock screen, bold as a dare. Keep her witch label, don't let up tonight. Forks paused mid-air. One guest blinked at the screen, then at me, then at Vera, as if passing a secret in a schoolroom. I kept my hands folded around the base of my water glass the way I hold a fragile vase when the table lurches. The room hummed with after-dinner clatter, coffee spoons, slow music, a muted laugh that couldn't decide if it should live or die. Callum dropped the phone face down. He smiled in the direction of no one, a theater mask with the elastic snapped. I breathed in, counted to 4, breathed out. Not yet. I wasn't there to fight a boy and his screen. I was there to finish what the paper had begun. Celine's napkin trembled, then stilled. Vera's pearls clicked. Staff lingered at the doorway, reading the room like weather soon. I let the lights dim another shade before I moved. The folder had ridden in my purse all night, thin as a blade. I slid it from the pocket and set it where the centerpiece's roses could not hide it. No speech, no flourish. Paper does not need permission. The room tilted toward the table. Selena's eyes found the tab and stayed there. Callum's smile twitched. Vera's mouth pressed into a line that leaves a mark even when sleep tries to iron it out. I opened the folder and eased the top page forward. Subject lines, time stamps, a sequence like footprints, skip the newspaper wrap, seat her near service, joke, then just a joke. The CC line to the MC was neat as a stitched hem. I did not look up. A chair scraped. Someone whispered emails. The syllables lifted, then dropped. I kept my voice level. These were sent about me, I said, while inviting me. I placed the next page beside the first, a screenshot of the seating chart notes, the pencil marks like bruises. Harlan leaned in until the candle's flame silvered his wedding band. Color slipped from his face the way daylight leaves a porch. Celine's hand hovered above paper not touching. Across from me, Callum checked his phone, then tucked it under a napkin as if darkness could unwrite what the printer had made real. Celine's chair scraped against the floor, a clean, unhurried sound that cut through the whispers. She rose and came to my side, palm warm on my shoulder. Enough, she said to her husband. No wobble, no apology. A ripple moved through the guests. Linen shifted a glass, touched down too carefully. The contract from earlier still lay near the roses. Its corner touched the email printouts like two witnesses. Callum's face narrowed. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice hunting for a place to stand. Vera reached for the folder and stopped halfway as if the paper might burn. This is out of context, she announced. I didn't answer. Harlan gripped the edge of the table and did not look at me. Mom, he started the word, an apology that never learned to walk. Celine stayed beside me. Grandma gave us tonight, she told the room, and we tried to make her disappear. No tears, no shouting, just a young tree refusing the push of cheap wind. My breath settled the way it does when a storm finally picks a direction and heads for the Gulf. Around us, Forks stilled. Even the silver held breath. I rose not to argue, but to name the ground I stood on. I was never the witch I said. I was the foundation. The words did not ring. They settled like a beam seating into place. A server paused. The room remembered quiet. I did not list the checks, the loans, the afternoons with sick children so others could work. I did not rehearse the years I kept my voice low so a fragile marriage next door could find its footing. The paper already carried those footprints. Tonight needed fewer words and more daylight. Families forget, I said. Documents don't. I thanked the staff and asked that the microphone stay where it was for anyone who wished to correct the record with kindness instead of rumor. No one moved. Callum looked young. Vera steadied her glass. I sat again. The chair met me like an old friend reclaimed. Across the table, Celine's chin lifted the way it did when she learned to balance on skates not brave because fearless brave, because learning how. Set it down, wordless. Okay. The microphone rested by my plate like a harmless tool. I didn't touch it. The power of a room as time and time had finally crossed the floor to sit beside me. Celine met my eyes. In that look, I saw birthday mornings and spilled glitter on my kitchen tile. The comic paper memory floated between us, silly superheroes and coupons, all the small economies that once made big days possible. She nodded once, as if answering a question I hadn't asked. Callum tried to speak, then settled for a shrug that didn't land. Vera stared at the emails as if staring could make ink repent. Some guests eased back into chairs. Others stood held by the sense that a page had turned. I lifted my coffee. The bitterness was honest. The room waited on me, which meant it was finally waiting on truth. They had their story, I said. Now it will meet its ledger. I set the cup down and let silence carry the rest. The night had bent, but it had not broken me. What came next would not be loud, it would be clear. Silence held the room the way a lid holds steam tight, sweating ready to scald. Coffee-cooled candles guttered into quiet commas, and no one quite met anyone's eyes. A low braid of whispers ran along the table's edge, tugging at phrases they'd seen and couldn't unsee. Keep her witch label. Skip the newspaper wrap. The printed pages lay between the roses like a spine. Callum cleared his throat as if to swallow back the night. "Look," he said. Shaping a smile that didn't belong to his face, things got carried away. If anyone felt offended, that wasn't the intention. He glanced around for nods, found none, and added, "We were trying to make the program smooth." I folded my napkin until the seam sat straight and small. He wasn't done. Men who need the last word seldom are. Vera rose on the hush fingers, still at her pearls, as though they were a rosary. Family, she began, voice-pitched for forgiveness she hadn't asked to give, is about grace and respect. Tonight was to honor Celine and certain theatrics have distracted us from what matters. She did not look at the emails. She looked through them. We have always tried to keep unity at the center. I regret that some people, a little pause, chose a different path. Chairs shifted. Someone at the far end let an audible scoff slip quick as a match. The words Vera wanted were lovely words polished by years of practice, but ink has no patience for rehearsal. I kept my hands folded. I let her speech hang in its own draft the way laundry hangs in air too damp to do the job. Paper had already unstitched it. Callum's hand came down hard, a slap that startled the silver. "This is manipulation," he snapped. "She brought fake documents to ambush us." "Do you hear me? Fake? Anyone can print emails. Anyone can type a seat chart." A couple guests flinched. One turned toward the door and didn't quite leave. I didn't move. Before my breath returned, Bryn stepped forward from the service corridor, calm as a courthouse clerk. "Sir," she said evenly, "the documents were verified when the deposit posted. The host of record matched the signature we received with payment. We also have the run of show notes time-stamped in our system." Her tone never changed temperature. Callum's outrage shrank against it like linen in hot water. He looked from Bryn to me and found no place to stand. From the end of the table came a voice I hadn't expected to hear again, warm baritone worn at the edges. "I can vouch," he said, raising one hand without ceremony. It was Alan Pierce Harlan's former partner, grayer, now kinder around the eyes. "I saw her sign checks when your first shop was on Hillcroft. Rent inventory the lot. Without her?" His gaze settled on my son and did not blink. None of this would stand. Harlan's throat bobbed. The room leaned toward the witness the way juries lean hungry for a clean line between story and fact. I bowed my head a fraction, not in surrender, but to mark the truth, spoken aloud by someone who had nothing to gain. The weight I'd carried for years moved an inch off my ribs. The moment didn't need a speech, it needed a period. I slid one last page from the folder and set it where everyone could see. No flourish, just paper, facing the light. Venue, letterhead, receipt number, date bank reference, and my signature in the same hand that taught second graders to cross a T. A quiet murmur ran through the guests, not gossip now, but arithmetic deposit balance paid. I did not announce it. I let ink do its work. Callum's shoulders sagged into his jacket. Vera stared at the total as if numbers were a language she hadn't prepared to hear tonight. Harlan's eyes filmed, then cleared, and he pressed both palms to the cloth as if bracing against a wind that suddenly blew true. I lifted my glass water, not wine, and took a measured sip. "They called me the witch," I said, voice low enough to keep the room close. Tonight I reminded them who built the fire they gather around. Beyond the windows, Houston's lights stitched the bayou into a ribbon. Inside, no one laughed. The lid had lifted. Steam had somewhere else to go. With the room quiet, Celine reaches for the package wrapped in Sunday comics and places it in the center of the table. No one tells a joke this time. She peels the tape with careful fingers, the paper sighing as it opens, and lifts the lid of a wooden box. Inside are a silver locket, 2 photos, and a folded letter. One photo is Celine at the splash pad on Allen Parkway. The other is Harlan at 10 gap-toothed and joyful. She traces them, then looks at me. I stand so we are shoulder to shoulder. "Read it," I say. She opens my letter and reads the lines I wrote, that love is not leverage, that history does not require shame, that I have no demands but honesty. I do not make a speech. The papers from earlier have spoken louder than any defense I could mount. Celine closes the letter and fastens the locket. Its hinge clicks a quiet sound even the servers can hear. I feel the weight settle at the base of my throat. I think of the years lost to suspicion and the small rituals that survived birthday comics, handwritten notes, the habit of keeping proof. Around us, chairs stop scraping. Even the ice in glasses goes still. The room is listening, and for once I do not have to raise my voice. I turn slightly and rest my hand on my chair. Before we all head home, I say I want to be clear about something simple. My voice stays steady. I will not accept insults at any gathering. Invitations must be sincere, not staged. Introductions must be truthful. I stop there. No theatrics. No raised volume. A few relatives glance toward Callum and Vera. I do not. Consequences will be quiet, I add. If respect fails, I leave. I won't argue at a doorway or plead for a chair. The words are narrow and clean, like a path I intend to walk. I thank the staff for their patience and the cousins who came from out of town. I thank Celine for the care she shows, even when pulled in 2 directions. My smile is small, deliberate. If boundaries are fences, mine is paint on the ground, visible, walkable, non-negotiable. I sit and the room exhales. Bryn stands near the wall, alert but at ease. Harlan rubs his forehead and stares at the contract by the centerpiece. Vera folds her napkin and keeps folding it as if tight corners could return control. Callum lifts his glass and finds it empty. We can be decent from here, I say at last, or we can be distant. No one mistakes which I prefer. Now Celine's chair scrapes softly as she stands. She walks to me, loops an arm around my shoulders, and turns to face the guests. "Thank you for staying," she says. Her voice is young but steady. I need to say something plain. My grandmother is the one who showed up for me. She built the base I stand on. I let tonight drift further than it should have. She looks at Callum. It stops. He starts to speak. She lifts a hand and he lets the words die. A few guests clap, unsure how loud. I feel her palm warm against my sleeve, a simple shelter. Across the table, Vera's mouth tightens, then smooths. Harlan's eyes glisten. He looks at me, then down. I do not lean into Celine or away from her. I stand on my own feet beside her and let the room absorb the shape of this choice. The contract from earlier still lies between the candles. The emails sit under a coaster. Truth stays put when it finally arrives. "Thank you," I tell Celine, and mean it. Not for choosing me over anyone, but for choosing sincerity over staging. She nods once, small and sure, and squeezes my shoulder. Room learns a shape. I pick up the microphone not to rehearse the past, but to define the present. I was never the witch, I say, level. I was the foundation. The words land without echo. I set the mic down and let the sentence stand on its own legs. Staff pause in the doorway. Someone coughs and then is quiet. I touch the locket at my throat and feel the hinge cool and certain. I describe nothing that doesn't need saying. I will be where truth is welcome, I add. I will not fight for a seat again. A nod to Bryn, a nod to the servers, a nod to the cousins gathering coats. I am not winning so much as returning to myself. Callum tries a smile that slips. Vera studies the tablecloth as if it holds a rescue plan. Harlan meets my eyes and looks away, then back again. I do not ask him for words. I do not ask anyone. Tonight I am asking only for order names used correctly. Effort, acknowledged, respect, paid in plain currency. The room can afford it. We all can. Outside traffic hushes along the road now. Lights soften. Relatives come by in ones and twos, arms brief and honest. No speeches, just the simple grammar of apology. A hand, a squeeze, a murmur. Celine stands with me, fingers finding mine. Could we do the next dinner at your house? She asks. Potluck. Simple. I picture my small kitchen, the cast iron skillet, the smell of onions and butter. Yes, I say. We'll keep the door open and the labels off. She smiles, eyes tired. Harlan steps close, voice low. He promises to repay the venue cost and to begin repairing his silence with a call tomorrow. I nod. Bryn confirms the paperwork once more and steps away. Callum starts toward the mic. Celine shakes her head and he stops. Vera gives a short apology that lands awkwardly but real enough. I let it be. I do not collect trophies. I collect peace. At the doorway, I touch the locket, breathe the damp Houston night, and walk out first. My pace is unhurried. My place is intact. Staff hold the doors. A breeze lifts a scrap of comics up. I've learned that dignity doesn't always require raising your voice. Sometimes it's the quiet proof you carry the patience to let truth speak for itself that restores your place at the table. My story reminds me, and maybe reminds you, that respect is not something we beg, for it's something we set as a boundary. Families stumble, words wound, but healing begins when we choose clarity over noise. What about you? Have you ever faced a moment where silence became your strength? Share your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments or let me know where you're watching from. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one.